My name is Michael Furminger. I hope that you can all hear me and that most people at least signed up for this are good to go and signed on. This is the latest in a series of presentations by Republic of Work in Cork called Lunch and Learn. It's a series of presentations covering content from which it is hoped that all businesses can learn something. The details are available on the Republic of Work website at republicofwork.com. My name is Michael Furminger. As an elected councillor, as a UK qualified barrister, and presently as a business consultant, I've been in the business of communicating professionally in writing for about 35 years. It is from that experience that I hope to draw in this presentation. This is the third in a series on communication that I've presented. The first one looked at communication generally, and the second at public speaking in particular. And today we're going to focus on written communication. I'm going to talk about written communication generally and not any form of written communication in particular. But everything that I say should be applicable to all forms of written communication. And obviously there'll be a variation in that to an extent, but my intention is that everything I say is applicable to all forms of written communication. Everything that I say will be based on my knowledge and experience of written communication in English. I'm sorry, I know nothing of the Irish language. I assume that anything I say in respect of communication in writing in English will apply equally to Irish. There might be instances where it doesn't. And as I say, my statement is based on an assumption only. In order to balance the time that I have to make a presentation and the time that I want to allow for questions afterwards, I ask that you save questions, please, for the end. I will make sure that I leave time at the end. And if we could save questions to the end, I think that'll enable us to manage time more effectively. I want to divide what I say into 5 sections. First, I'll define what I mean by communication and what I mean by writing. Secondly, I'll talk about the context in which written communication takes place. Thirdly, I'll move from the general to the specific, and I will make the important point that effective communication in writing is about much more than the application of characters to a page, whether it's a digital electronic page or a physical paper page. It's about more than application of characters to a page. Fourthly, I'll look at the different aspects of written communication that we need to think about. One, in order to decide whether to use written communication at all, and secondly, in order to decide how best to use it. And lastly, I'll look at some of the practical skills, the hints and tips on how we can write more effectively. Okay, so to start off with definitions, what is communication? Communication is a coming together. It's a meeting. It's from the Latin word communis. It refers to something that's common or shared. And there's the clue to the most important aspect of communication. Think of a whole bunch of words: communion, community, commerce, commune, comity, combine, common. The list goes on and on. Look in a dictionary. But there's an element of sharing that all of those words refer to, an element of meeting, that there are two or more aspects involved in all of those words. And that's true of communication. There's got to be an element of meeting for communication to occur. Communication is a two-way process. And unless we realize that, we won't be good at it. The key to effective communication is to realize that it's a two-way process. There is a fundamental distinction between communication and publication. To publish something is not to communicate. To write something and put it out there, whether on a website or in a book or in an email, doesn't matter what, but to write something and put it out there is not necessarily to achieve communication. All we've done is publish. And in order to achieve communication, we need to secure reception. Publication and reception equals communication. Communication requires both publication and reception. And as the amount of publication increases, which it has done exponentially, certainly since the advent of the internet, it has done throughout history, but the internet has caused that expansion to increase exponentially. As the amount of publication increases, so our ability to communicate actually declines because we've got to compete with so much more. Our publication will need to compete with so much more. There's so much more written communication out there. Ours has to be better and better in order to be received by our audience, in order that we've communicated. That's why this talk is so important, because in order for our written publication to secure communication, it needs to be better and better. It needs to be more effective, which is what we're about. What is writing? Well, there are a number of definitions of writing. For my purposes today, I will define writing as the application of characters, images, or graphics in long-lasting form on a document, whether physical or electronic. I'll say that again. Writing is the application of characters, images, or graphics in long-lasting form on a document, whether physical or electronic. There are many, many, many different types of writing. We can think of handwriting on old-fashioned paper. We can think of printed writing on old-fashioned paper, or indeed on anything else. We can think of so much more today that is purely digital. Some documents are written and they're never intended to be printed. Now, whether they are or not is another matter, but many today are documents are created that are really only ever going to be electronic. We can think of social media. Facebook's all about written communication. Twitter's all about written communication. Email is another obvious example of written communication. Texts are written communication. Written communication, I mean, there's old-fashioned books. Written communication comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes, but at heart, it's the application of characters to a document. And that's what we're talking about today. The context in which written communication occurs, it's important to have some understanding of context in order that we can understand really what we're about in written communication. Written communication is ubiquitous. It's almost impossible to imagine any society that wouldn't have any written communication. I think it's absolutely impossible to imagine advanced modern society without any written communication. Advanced modern society would be impossible without writing. If we think about internet and books, for example, those two media are the way in which we store knowledge and share knowledge. Both are absolutely dependent upon written communication. And if we think about all the other ways in which we use written communication, from nuclear treaties to instructions as to how to open a basic packet of anything, it's all based on written communication. If we think of our economy, everything from a price label in a shop to an international agreement between two multinational companies, everything is based on the ability to communicate effectively in writing. It is, I suggest, impossible to imagine modern society without written communication. Technology, far from diminishing the need for written communication, has enhanced the importance of written communication. Somebody once suggested that the advance of technology would do away with the need for paper. Well, we all know that that hasn't happened. But what also hasn't happened is there hasn't been any reduction in the importance of written communication. In fact, I would suggest that the use of technology has increased the importance of written communication. Email, for example, over the last 4 years or so, has increased consistently by 5% every single year on year. And it's difficult today to discuss anything much without talking about the virus. If you search on the internet, Google, if that's the way you search, put in inverted commas the following phrase: COVID-19 has changed everything. Put that in inverted commas. Approximately 143,000 results. So often on the news, so often in newspapers, we read that COVID-19, the virus, has changed everything. Everything is one of those absolute words. It means absolutely what it says. Everything means everything. Has the virus changed the way in which we communicate? Yes, it has. The fact that we are here today communicating in this form proves that. There's increasing anecdotal evidence to suggest that what the virus has done to communication is to substantially diminish informal communication. The communication that we used to enjoy, the conversation over a cup of coffee, the conversation over a pint of beer, the conversation over a chance meeting in the street, those things have declined. Yeah, sure, they're coming back to an extent, but for months, those things almost disappeared entirely. What increased was formal communication, because everybody was working the work we've become so used to remotely, at a distance. We've become used to working at a distance. We've become used to working remotely, and relatively formal communication has increased. And one very large component, I mean, we all know about Zoom now and video communication, but one very large component in that formal communication that's increased as a result of the virus is written communication. That has advantages and disadvantages, but the fact is it's happened. And it's one of the consequences of the virus, I suggest, that will last, that will stay with us, that our use of written communication will increase. So I've talked about the definitions of what I mean by writing and what I mean by communication. I've also now talked about the context in which written communication arises. In now moving to look at some of the practical aspects and the practical skills, it's important to say this. Written communication, the ability to communicate effectively in writing, is about more than the ability to apply characters to a page, whether a physical page or an electronic page. The ability to write, either by hand or through a keyboard, is a necessary skill, but it is not a sufficient skill in order to communicate effectively. We learn to write by hand, and I suppose today increasingly by using a keyboard. We learn to write at school. But in order to communicate effectively, we have to do so much more than that. Being able to write by hand or type on a keyboard is like being able to apply paint to a canvas. I can apply paint to a canvas.
God.
That does not make me an artist. Apart from the application of characters to a page, there are lots of other factors that are going to help us communicate effectively in writing. We'll spend the rest of our time together looking at what turns someone who can write into a communicator. What is it that turns somebody from a painter into an artist? There are certain characteristics of written communication that might be an advantage in some situations, a disadvantage in others. What's important is that in any given situation, we are aware of the factors that I'm about to list, and that we are aware that we can use them in order to communicate in writing more effectively. The first one I'll mention is timing. If we are going to communicate in writing, if we choose to communicate in writing, we have an absolute discretion as to when we draft what we publish. We can put that writing together at any time that suits us. If we have a conversation on a telephone, well, we can choose to an extent when we make that telephone call, but we can't choose entirely. It's not a great idea to call somebody at 2 in the morning. If we receive a telephone call, we've got pretty much no discretion at all when we receive it. The only discretion we've got is whether we answer it or not. But if we're choosing to write something, and that includes reply to something, we can choose when we do that. If I receive a letter today, I can choose whether to reply to it today or tomorrow or next week, or not at all. If I receive a phone call right now, I've got to decide immediately. I'm put on the spot. Do I answer it or not? Writing gives us a choice. It gives us more choice. It gives us more flexibility. As well as giving us more choice and flexibility, when we write to someone, whether that's a letter or an email, we give them choice and flexibility. And sometimes when we want to communicate with someone, we might want to give them that choice and flexibility. And at other times, we might not. We might want to put somebody on the spot. So there's the first factor that we need to be aware of in choosing whether to communicate in writing or not. And if we choose to do so, then quite how we do that. Think about speed. There are differences in the speed at which different media can achieve communication. A text is probably the fastest way to communicate with somebody. I mean, we're all different, but texts tend to be read pretty quickly. They're short, they're punchy. In my experience, I suggest the text is probably the fastest way to communicate with someone. And a phone call would be pretty quickly behind that. Slower probably is email. Some people will read each and every email as it arrives on a phone. Probably if you get a lot of emails, you're not going to do that. But email's pretty quick. If anyone uses fax anymore, some lawyers still use fax. That's also pretty quick. And of course, the slowest means is a letter in the mail. Although that's faster in Ireland than in other places I've lived. So think about the speed at which you want to communicate, because that'll make a difference as to the medium of communication that you choose to use. And text is written, email's written, old-fashioned snail mail is written. So it not only makes a difference as to whether you choose to communicate in writing or not, it also makes a difference to which form of written communication you might use. Written communication usually also takes longer to put together. It simply takes most people longer to type than they could speak. Even if we're sort of bashing out a quick text, it's probably going to take longer than it is to say something on the telephone. But sometimes you'll want that time. And that's the next thing I want to mention. Written communication gives us time to think. It gives us opportunity to consult with other people. We could write something and show somebody a draft. With a phone call, you don't tend to plan it, rehearse it, write a script. It happens sometimes, but it doesn't happen terribly often. Whereas with written communication, we have lots of opportunity to think. The English vocabulary is one of the biggest in the world. Some people say it's the biggest, but it's one of the biggest in the world. One of the benefits of that is that it gives us vast shades of meaning. And we can take time to choose exactly the words that we want to use. That's an opportunity that's not possible on the phone, unless we are incredibly quick-witted and have an incredibly wide vocabulary. It's highly unlikely that we will get every word right in a conversation, because simply haven't got the knowledge or can't think that quickly. Whereas if we write something, we can put it together with much more thought, chance to look up some words. We can get our meaning absolutely right. That's something that often we will want to take advantage of, and it's something that we can really only do in writing. Ease of circulation is something worth thinking about. All forms of communication today can be circulated very easily. Videos can be shared, audio recordings can be shared, but the written word is still much easier to share than those things. Sometimes we'll want something to be shared very easily, and sometimes we won't. Again, think about it. Do you want to give somebody something that can be easily shared? Sometimes, yes, we will. Other times, no, we won't. Writing gives a very easy and quick, permanent record of something. That's part of my definition of writing, that it's long-lasting, more or less permanent. Sometimes we'll want that, sometimes we won't. That issue should make a difference to you as to whether you want to put something in writing or not. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. Sometimes others will wish you had, sometimes others will wish you hadn't. But think about it. It's something to think about before you say. Writing probably gives us the ability to either say something, and if we decide to say it, how to say it. Writing probably also gives us the greatest opportunity not to say something. If I'm talking to somebody on a phone or in a video meeting and I don't say something, I don't cover a subject that they want me to cover, or I don't say something about a certain aspect of something, it's very easy for them to come back at me and ask, well, what about this, Michael? If I write something, yeah, sure, they can come back to me and say, well, you didn't cover this. But then I get a chance to think about whether I respond to that at all, and if I do, how I do. But writing gives you the ability, and it's difficult for somebody to challenge, it gives you the ability to just not say something, or if you do say something, how you say it. Whereas if I'm having a telephone conversation with somebody, someone can say, oh, you haven't mentioned this. What do you think about this? And pretty much I've got to answer that, at least to some extent. So again, if it's a subject upon which you want to think very carefully about what you say and how you say it and whether you say something at all, think about putting it in writing, because it's going to be a lot easier for you to make those decisions, and it's much easier to get away with those decisions. Writing gives you the opportunity to be clear in a response. If somebody is presenting you with a business proposal and there are 5 points to that business proposal, writing enables you, a written response would give you the ability to go through each of those 5 aspects and say what you thought about each one. Maybe you agree with 4, but not with number 5. Or maybe you agree with all of them, but there are aspects that you want to clarify. Much easier to do that precisely in writing than it ever will be in a telephone conversation or even a face-to-face meeting. Something you'll have all heard of is the phrase that says a picture is worth 1,000 words. A great advantage of written communication, in which I include graphics and images, is that I don't know about a picture saving 1,000 words, but a picture can save very many words. That's completely impossible in a strictly oral form. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of written communication is that it's a relatively narrow form of communication. Here I am, hopefully, communicating with you using the spoken word. But I'm communicating in other ways as well. You can see me. You can see what the background here is. You can see what I'm wearing. You can hear that I've got an English accent. You can make some assessment of whether I'm proficient or not at putting together a video presentation. There are so many other ways in which I'm communicating with you. You can even see some body language. There are so many ways in which I'm communicating with you other than the spoken word. And that would be true of other forms of communication. But in written communication, that's very narrow. It's not entirely devoid of everything else, and we'll talk about some of that in a minute. But it's a very narrow form of communication. Sometimes that will be a really good thing. So sometimes that really will be a good thing. Other times it won't be. So again, think about it. Think about whether that suits your purpose. We always need to know our purpose in communication. So think about whether that narrowness is a good thing or not. And lastly, on this list of aspects of communication that you need to be aware of is that although today there are controls on all sorts of information and all sorts of communication, by controls I'm referring to data protection, those controls are still inevitably more rigorously applied to written communication. It's much easier to regulate, it's much easier to check. It used to be said, back in certainly in the 80s, but probably still in the early 90s, when data protection laws were first coming in, it used to be said, well, if you don't want anybody to know about something, if you don't want to have to record something, just say it in a telephone conversation. Not true anymore, but still much easier to communicate informally than it is to communicate in writing, because that's much easier to subject to controls such as data protection. Okay. I'm now on to section 5, the last section. I want to talk about some of the practicalities of effective writing. What are the practical ways in which we can improve the effectiveness of communication? First thing we need to be aware of is what we use most of the time in order to communicate in writing. I'm talking about the English alphabet, 26 characters. Quite amazing, really, that everything that we communicate is based on 26 characters. But what we need to be aware of is that the range of characters that we have to communicate in writing is actually much wider than those 26 letters of the alphabet. Think about a keyboard. Many more characters on a keyboard than 26. And often, if we, as most of us will know, there are more characters available on a keyboard than what we can see in front of us. Press 2 or 3 buttons together and we get a character that's not shown on the keyboard, but it's available. Those characters can help us communicate our meaning more clearly. For example, there are currency symbols that are available on a keyboard. You might not see it on the keyboard, but it's available if you know which keys to press to get it. And often a Google search will reveal what we need to press in order to get it, and that will depend on which computer we're using. But there are many more characters available to us than simply the 26 letters of the alphabet. Those characters will help us communicate our meaning. They will also help demonstrate that we know what we're talking about, that we're competent, because we can use a currency symbol rather than using a word because we couldn't find the symbol. I'm increasingly aware, having lived in Ireland now for a while, that the Irish language makes use of accents. And in order to write someone's name correctly, or to write the name of an organization, especially some of the state organizations, that accents are necessary. If I don't use those, I'm demonstrating my ignorance of the Irish language, which, yeah, I am pretty ignorant of the Irish language. But at least when I'm writing, let's get somebody's name right. Let's pay due regard to somebody's name, or due regard to the to a state organization. So use all of the characters that are available to you, which is broader than the 26 letters of the alphabet. The other thing to use are characters that aren't alphabetical or symbolic in the same sense as what I've been talking about so far. People use emojis all the time now. Sometimes we can communicate things by using emojis that would take words and words and words to communicate. Use them. Use graphs. Use charts of different sorts. And I go back to the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Think about the appearance of writing on a page. Let's think about paper to start with. Now most of the time now we don't use paper to communicate in writing. But think about the effect when we do use paper to communicate in writing. If a letter is formal, if you want an invitation to appear as a special invitation, think about the classic old style invitations on cards with a gold edge. Think about the impact that makes. If we use top-end, heavy stationery, using paper or even card like that will carry a meaning quite apart from the words that are written on it. I can use the same words in an email and you'll probably think it pompous. But if I use those formal words on some very nice stationery, they are much more likely to achieve their desired effect. So think firstly about the medium that we're going to use. And when we're thinking top-end stationery, don't just think about the paper, think about the envelope. It's no good putting a nice piece of vellum paper into an ordinary brown envelope. Get some envelopes that match. If you want to deliver a special message and you've chosen to write it and put it on paper for that reason, then don't spoil the words, don't spoil the effect of the words by the stationery that you use. If we are choosing to communicate in writing on paper, then in order to be effective, that written communication might need to be on a certain sort of paper. For the same reasons, think about the ink that we use, the instrument with which we write if we're talking about handwriting. Few of us probably now use fountain pens, but if we're going to use an ordinary ballpoint pen of whatever sort, then at least find one that doesn't blotch and doesn't smear. Think about the colour that we're going to write in. Now, this applies to handwriting, but it also applies to digital writing, typing. We tend to use blue and black. Fine. If that document that we are creating, especially if it's say a handwritten, well, I ought to say a handwritten signature. If it's a handwritten signature and it's a legal document, often the form will say use black ink. But even if it doesn't, and you know that form's going to be copied, black copies way better than blue. Blue's a bit iffy. Sometimes it'll copy fine, sometimes it won't. So think about the colour that is going to be most effective to use. But we can use colour, especially if we're communicating digitally, we can use colour very easily and very effectively. Think about it. And there are other colours that maybe it's inappropriate to use. Some colours are terribly difficult to see. Write somebody an email in red. Conventional wisdom suggests that that's a rather hostile, aggressive thing to do. So think about use of colour. Think about different fonts. Some fonts are informal, some are informal. Sorry, did I say informal twice? Some are formal, some are informal. Think about it. The choice of the font needs to be consistent with the message. Is it an informal piece of writing, in which case, fine, there are some pretty funky fonts out there. If it's a formal piece of writing, think about the font that you're going to use. Think about the size of the font. Make your document easy for your reader to read. Don't write too small. Although we can use different sizes, different size fonts on the same text, sometimes that will actually make things easier to understand. And look at the overall appearance of a page. Sometimes we'll look at a page of writing and it's way too dense. It just doesn't even look inviting to read. In fact, it looks rather difficult to read. Think about spacing, think about line spacing. That'll make something easier to read. It also enables people to write notes between the lines as they go. Think about breaking up text, perhaps, with a photo. It's easy today to insert a photo into a document if we're creating that document digitally. It breaks up a page. It just makes it look more inviting. It makes it look more interesting. That will help you communicate more effectively because your reader's much more willing to read what you've written. Be aware of your audience. Now, that's a fundamental feature of all effective communication. To whom am I trying to get this message across? With whom am I seeking to communicate? We need to define our audience, and we need to write whatever we're writing appropriately to the audience. So think about, for example, choice of vocabulary. You don't want everybody running to a dictionary to understand what you've written. Write with an appropriate vocabulary and write in accordance with the level of knowledge that's appropriate for that audience. If you're writing to an audience that's not going to know much about your subject, you might need to define some things. If you're writing to an audience that's very familiar with your subject, frankly, if you explain everything, it'll get rather tedious and rather annoying, and I'll start skipping pages. And lastly, think about the structure of what you're writing. Now, the longer and more complicated a document is, the more important the points that I'm about to make are. Think about a title. When we're writing anything, think about a title. A title is usually a good idea, but try and think about a title that conveys to the audience something of what that writing's about. Give them a clue. It's much easier to lead your reader in. If you think about it in that sense, make the document that you're writing accessible. Start to think of it in terms of a gateway or a signpost. After we've thought about a title, think about, especially on a longer document, think about a contents list. Providing a contents list, it's almost like providing a map. It'll give somebody a really good idea of what that document's about, and it'll give them a map. And if they want to go to one section before they go to another, they're easily able to do that. But I think the much more important use of a contents list is it gives them a map. It gives them a really good idea of what they're going to find and where they're going to find it. Think about providing a summary. Again, the longer a document and the more complicated it is, the more a summary becomes a good idea. A summary could just be, well, it could be a few sentences, depending on the length and the complexity of the document. It could be a few sentences. It could be a paragraph. Unless we're writing a very long document, probably it shouldn't be more than a page. But a summary, even more than a contents list, will give somebody a quick overview of what's in the document. Incredibly useful in then when you wade into the meat of the document, a summary will help dramatically for the reader to understand it. Think about headings. Often, even in a relatively short document, even perhaps in an email, it makes it much easier for the reader to understand what you're saying, therefore to receive what you're saying, if there are headings. And even if not headings, then perhaps highlight some key phrases. Or if there's a call to action at the end of the email, then maybe put that in bold. So somebody doesn't read the email and think, well, so what? Maybe put headings in bold. Maybe just in a body of a paragraph, put something in bold. Think about numbered paragraphs. Even the shortest document, maybe if it's sort of, I don't know, sort of 10 paragraphs or more, give the paragraph some numbers, because it's going to help somebody. It's going to help you refer to something you've already written. You can then say, see paragraph 4. It'll save you writing it again or trying to refer to something in uncertain terms. It also enables somebody to respond very clearly to what you've said. So think about numbering paragraphs, and in addition, perhaps, if, again, the longer the document, the more this might be true, but number pages as well, because it enables you to refer to something you've said earlier, but it also enables your reader to refer back to you and say, oh, it's what you say in paragraph 4 that causes me a problem, or can I ask you a question about paragraph 7, or whatever. It's much easier to refer to what you've written. Think about using things like bullet points. If I write a list of something and it's hidden in the middle of a paragraph, sometimes quite hard for the reader to see that there's a list at all, and sometimes quite hard to see what that list comprises. Bullet point says, here's a list, and this is what the list is. it makes it stand out. It also helps to break up the page. There's more white around on the page. It's part of the point. Make the page as inviting as possible. Think about highlighting. Easy today to highlight text. It's something else that can be used. And think about the use of footnotes. In some circumstances, footnotes can make a page look intimidating. In other circumstances, a footnote will enable you to include some information that it's really good that information is there, but you can hide it away and it doesn't distract from the flow of the text. Think also about where you want that footnote to appear. The conventional two options, either a footnote can sit at the bottom of a page or a footnote can sit at the end of the text. There are pros and cons to either approach, but think about that. And a point I've made before on a number of occasions, think about using pictures and graphs. That's always a useful device. So I'm aware of the time. It's 10 to 2, so I ought to stop and ask if there are any questions. And at this point, the technology might get interesting because I don't quite know how the questions are going to work, because this is about written communication. And here we go. We're going to try some electronic oral communication. I can see looks like there's 3 entries on the chat screen. So I wonder if I have a look. Okay. So someone has asked whether or not there'll be a summary available of the session. As I understand it, and maybe somebody at Republic of Work can butt in at that point, if at this point, if they're available too. But I understand that this session is recorded. So that's not a summary, but it does mean that the whole thing will be available. Is there anyone out there that can butt in and say whether this session is recorded or not?
It is being recorded. I can see up at the top left-hand corner. So I think if you email the Republic of Work, either DC or Ange, they will be able to send you the recording. Okay, great. And I think also, looking last night, that all of the previous sessions, or at least a number of the most recent ones, are also available on the website. So I think that it'll be available on the website for anybody as well. So that's not a summary, but if it's available, I realized I've covered a lot of ground very quickly. So there's another, oh, here we go. There's another question here. If I want to communicate with someone about a mistake that they're doing which is causing trouble, what is the best way of communicating? That's probably slightly off topic, but that's bound to depend on the issue involved and the degree of relationship that we have with the person who's, in the words of the question, causing the trouble. Tricky one. I mean, general principle, face-to-face is probably the best way to always try and sort something out, but I think it would depend very much on the circumstances. Does anyone else have any questions? And we'll see if that we can spot people. I'm not hearing anything.
I have a question.
Go on.
Yeah, when we think about the effectiveness of communication, like say for example, I'm addressing a huge audience. Say for example, I'm in a public, like I'm communicating some information to a to a large set of people. So then the audience whom I'm communicating to, I wouldn't be aware of too much, assuming that it is a technical communication and people are aware of that. but however, like I wouldn't be aware like how each person will perceive the information. So in that, under those circumstances, like what is the best way of communicating? Say for example, if I'm communicating over an email, and then what should I pay more attention to when I'm communicating like that?
Well, I suppose to try and keep my answer to written communication with which we're dealing, I'd make 2 points. One, that probably, because you're talking about oral communication to a large group of people in one place, that to me would increase the importance of, in addition to the oral presentation, would be to provide some notes for people as well. If you really doubted people's ability, or at least you knew very little of people's ability to understand what you were seeking to communicate, then that would underline the importance to me of providing a set of notes, because at least that gives somebody second chance to go back and see what you said. The second point I'd make is this, and this is a feature of written communication that I'm not sure I mentioned directly, which is, with written communication, we have next to no idea on how people are receiving what we've published. Well, one, we have no idea whether they're receiving it. Two, we have very little idea on if they are receiving it, how they're receiving it. Whereas if I stand up in front of a group of people and make a presentation, I've got lots of clues as to whether they agree with what I'm saying, whether they don't agree, whether they understand it, whether they don't understand it. I've got lots of clues. But if I publish something in writing and you read it wherever you are, until I get some response, I've got no idea whether it's understood at all. So what you're saying actually highlights another aspect of written communication. It's in many ways, it's a disadvantage of written communication. Because we have so few clues as to how our publication is being received.
Yeah, thank you. So an additional question would be like taking an example, say for example, if I'm writing a blog. So like thousands of people write a blog. However, only a few of them become popular, and few of them, like if I have to use the internet terminology, few of them become viral, whereas others don't become viral. However, the content remains the same, whereas only some of them are able to touch the audience, and then it becomes more popular. So what is that which attracts or appeals to most of the audience, which makes a particular piece of article more popular?
Of course, if any of us knew the answer to that question, we'd probably all be doing something other than what we're doing. To be slightly less flippant, a lot of that turns on subject matter, which is way outside the subject of this presentation. But inevitably, some of it turns on exactly the sort of thing I've been talking about, which is we need to be very defined about who our audience is. We need to know who we're aiming at, and we need to be able to communicate in writing, because you're talking about a blog, so it's a written form of communication. We need to understand our target audience well enough that we communicate not only in terms of subject matter, but also in terms of style. We need to communicate in a way that's going to work with that audience. And that's about, really at the end of the day, that's about knowing your audience. And knowing that audience very, very well. That sort of question, that sort of issue highlights the importance of knowing your audience. Probably there's time for one more question.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, it sounds not, so I might use the last 2 minutes to say thank you for joining this. as far as I know, that this is going to be available on Republic of Work's website, so you get a chance to have a look again if you can bear the prospect of doing that. And if you've got other questions, I don't know who you'd contact at Republic of Work, but I'm quite happy to answer other questions. So if you get in touch with Republic of Work, they know how to reach me, rather than me try and give you an email address right now. But they know how to reach me. I'm quite happy to engage, quite happy to answer questions in writing or otherwise. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that it's been of some benefit. It's almost exactly spot on 2 o'clock. So out of respect for everybody's time, I shall say thank you and try and end this session effectively. Thank you very much indeed.